The security monitor in my office flickered, showing two figures approaching the front door of the Grandview lofts. My stomach dropped. It had been 3 years since I'd last spoken to them, but I recognized them instantly. My mother, Sharon, with her designer handbag catching the Dallas afternoon light, my father, Robert, adjusting his expensive watch. They looked exactly as I remembered, polished, judgmental, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. I leaned back in my leather chair, a cold prickle of curiosity running down my spine. What in the world were they doing here? My building's doorman, Miguel, greeted them professionally at the entrance. They didn't acknowledge his courtesy. Sharon swept past him like he was invisible while Robert barked out directions, Unit 4B. Unit 4B. The smallest studio in the building. I'd purchased this property 2 years ago, transforming a neglected pre-war structure into one of Dallas's most sought-after residential addresses. The renovation had cost millions, but the investment paid off spectacularly. Every unit commanded premium rent, except for 4B, which I kept affordable for graduate students and young professionals just starting out. My phone buzzed. A text from Miguel, Miss Eleanor, 2 visitors claim to be your parents. Should I send them up? I typed back quickly. Which floor did they request? Miguel's reply came moments later, 4th floor Unit B. They insist you live there. A slow, wry smile stretched across my face. Of course. My parents assumed I occupied the cheapest apartment in the building. In their minds, I'd thrown away my future when I refused to join the family real estate empire. Walking away from Patterson Development meant embracing failure, poverty, and obscurity. They'd made their opinions devastatingly clear during our final argument. Let them proceed, I messaged Miguel. Don't correct their assumption. I want to see how this plays out. I switched camera angles, following their progress through the lobby. Sharon's heels clicked against the restored marble floors. She actually wrinkled her nose at the Art Deco light fixtures I'd spent weeks sourcing from estate sales. Robert, ever the appraiser, glanced around with that calculating expression he wore when evaluating properties for demolition. They approached the elevator, and I watched Sharon press the button with one manicured finger. The doors opened immediately. I'd installed state-of-the-art elevators during the renovation, replacing the ancient system that had barely functioned. My parents stepped inside without a hint of appreciation for the craftsmanship surrounding them. The 4th floor camera captured their exit. Sharon's expression shifted from disdain to something resembling vindication. The hallway was narrow here, the original architecture preserved to maintain the building's historic character. To someone determined to find fault, it might appear cramped or outdated. This is exactly what I expected, Sharon's voice came through the audio feed, dripping with contempt. She always was stubborn. Now look where that stubbornness has gotten her. Robert examined the walls with exaggerated concern. These look like they haven't been painted in decades. The whole building probably violates half a dozen housing codes. I could have corrected them through the intercom system. Instead, I watched them locate Unit 4B and knock sharply on the door. The current tenant, a medical student named Chloe, had left for her hospital rotation an hour ago. No one would answer. Sharon knocked again, louder this time. She's probably at work, she sniffed. Some menial job to pay rent on this shoebox. Robert added, we should have come during business hours. But I wanted to see this place for myself. When Brenda told us she'd run into our daughter at that charity, Eleanor, wearing last season's dress and claiming to work in property management, I knew we had to visit. I remembered Brenda Whitmore, Sharon's former bridge partner. I'd told her exactly that during our chance encounter, property management. The truth was far more complex. I owned the Grandview lofts outright, along with 2 other residential properties in prime locations. My company, Apex Holdings, operated with deliberate discretion. Most people in Dallas's real estate circles knew the company name without connecting it to mine. Sharon pressed her ear against the door of 4B. I don't hear anything. Maybe she's not even here. Try calling her, Robert suggested. I watched Sharon pull out her phone. My cell rang moments later, the screen displaying mother with no accompanying warmth. I declined the call, sending it to voicemail. She tried twice more before giving up. Typical, she huffed. Still refusing to speak to us. As if she has any right to be angry after the embarrassment she caused. The embarrassment. They'd interpreted my departure from Patterson Development, announced at a company dinner attended by their most important clients and investors, as an unforgivable slight. I'd prepared a speech explaining my decision to pursue independent ventures, but they'd interrupted before I could finish. Robert had called me ungrateful. Sharon had suggested I'd lost my mind. The evening had ended with me walking out while they sat in stunned silence. That was 3 years ago. I was 27, terrified, but certain I'd made the right choice. I'd spent the previous 5 years working at Patterson Development, watching my parents acquire buildings only to gut them for maximum profit. They prioritized returns over communities, displacing long-term residents to construct luxury developments nobody local could afford. My approach was different. I bought neglected properties with potential and restored them thoughtfully. The Grandview Lofts had been abandoned for years, a beautiful building left to decay after the previous owner's death. I purchased it for a fraction of its value and spent 18 months bringing it back to life. Now, it housed artists, teachers, entrepreneurs, and families who appreciated living somewhere with character and history. The penthouse where I actually lived occupied the entire top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city. The original owner had been an architect who designed the space with meticulous attention to detail. I'd preserved his vision while adding modern conveniences. My home was a masterpiece of old-world elegance and contemporary comfort. My parents knew nothing about any of this. After our falling out, they'd stopped following my career. They'd assumed my silence meant failure. The truth was that I'd succeeded beyond my wildest projections while they continued their destructive business practices. On the monitor, Sharon knocked on 4B one final time. "We'll wait in the lobby. She has to come home eventually." They rode the elevator back down, and I watched them settle into the lobby's vintage chairs. Robert pulled out his phone while Sharon examined her reflection in a compact mirror. They looked supremely confident, ready to deliver whatever lecture they'd prepared about my disappointing life choices. I gave them 20 minutes to get comfortable. Then I called Miguel at the front desk. "Miss Eleanor," he answered immediately. "Those 2 visitors in the lobby," I said. "They're trespassing. I'd like them removed from the building." Miguel hesitated. "They claim to be your parents." "They are my parents. They're also trespassing. I never invited them here, and they've been harassing one of my tenants by repeatedly knocking on her door. Please escort them out and inform them they're not welcome on this property." "Understood. Should I call the police if they refuse to leave?" "Yes. And Miguel, make sure they understand that this building has security protocols for a reason. We don't allow people to wander around bothering our residents." I switched to the lobby camera, settling in to watch the confrontation. Miguel approached my parents with professional courtesy. I couldn't hear the conversation, but their body language told the story clearly. Robert stood abruptly, gesturing angrily. Sharon's face flushed red. Miguel remained calm, gesturing toward the exit. Robert pulled out his phone, probably trying to call me again. I declined the call without listening to the voicemail. He tried twice more with the same result. Finally, Miguel must have mentioned the possibility of police involvement because my parents reluctantly moved toward the door. Just before they reached the exit, Sharon turned and looked directly at the security camera. Her expression combined fury and humiliation in equal measure. She'd realized someone was watching their ejection. She just didn't know that someone was me. After they left, I called Miguel again. "Thank you for handling that professionally. Of course, Miss Eleanor. Should I add them to the restricted list? Yes. If they return, don't engage. Just call the police immediately. I thought the incident was over. I'd enjoyed a moment of petty satisfaction watching my parents get removed from my building, but I expected them to retreat and lick their wounds in private. I underestimated their determination to maintain their narrative about my failed life. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. Is this the owner of the Grandview Lofts? A woman's voice asked. Speaking, I replied. Who's calling? This is Sarah Hayes from the Dallas Building Department. We've received a complaint about your property. Multiple code violations, improper maintenance, unsafe living conditions. I need to schedule an inspection. My grip tightened on the phone. That's interesting, considering we passed a full inspection 6 months ago when we completed our renovation. Who filed this complaint? I'm not at liberty to say, but the allegations are serious enough that we need to investigate. Fine. Schedule the inspection. You'll find everything is up to code and then some. I'd also like to know who filed this false report. If someone is deliberately wasting city resources, that should be documented. Sarah's tone softened slightly. Between you and me, the complaint did seem unusually detailed for someone who doesn't live in the building. We'll conduct a thorough inspection and determine whether further action is necessary. After the call ended, I pulled up the building inspection records on my computer. The Grandview Lofts had passed every single check with flying colors. The electrical system was completely updated. The plumbing was brand new. We'd reinforced the foundation and replaced the roof. Every apartment met or exceeded current housing standards. The inspection happened 3 days later. Sarah Hayes arrived with a colleague, and they spent 4 hours examining every floor. I accompanied them personally, answering questions and providing documentation. By the end, Sarah looked impressed rather than concerned. This is one of the best maintained buildings I've seen in years, she admitted. Whoever filed that complaint was either misinformed or deliberately dishonest. We'll close this case as unfounded. Can you tell me who filed the report now? She consulted her tablet. A Robert Patterson and Sharon Patterson. They claim to have visited the building and witnessed numerous violations. My parents, of course. They tried to use the city bureaucracy to create problems for me, probably hoping the inspection would uncover issues that would force me to sell or abandon the property. Instead, they'd wasted everyone's time and documented their own vindictiveness in an official complaint. Those are my parents, I said. We're estranged. They showed up uninvited earlier this week and were removed for trespassing. Apparently, they decided to retaliate by filing a false report. Sarah's expression shifted to sympathy. I'm sorry you're dealing with that. For what it's worth, it's clear you run an excellent property. We'll note in our report that the complaint was without merit. After she left, I sat in my office, considering my options. My parents had escalated beyond mere judgment and disapproval. They were actively trying to sabotage my business. The false building complaint could have damaged my reputation if the inspection had somehow found problems. It could have frightened my tenants or complicated my relationships with contractors and suppliers. I'd walked away from their toxicity 3 years ago, but they refused to let me exist in peace. They wanted me to fail so dramatically that I'd have no choice but to crawl back and beg forgiveness. They wanted to prove their worldview correct, that their way was the only way, and anyone who defied them would face consequences. The memories came flooding back as I sat there. I remembered the exact moment I decided to leave Patterson Development. It was during a meeting about a property acquisition in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Dallas. The building housed 43 families, most of whom had lived there for decades. My father had outlined his plan to purchase the property, evict everyone, and construct luxury condos that would sell for triple the current market value. What about the residents? I'd asked. Where are they supposed to go? Robert had looked at me like I'd suggested burning money. That's not our concern. They're renters. They have no equity, no stake. We're offering the landlord fair market value. What happens afterward is business. It's not just business, I'd argued. These are real people with jobs and schools and community ties. We could renovate the existing structure, bring it up to code, maybe raise rents modestly to cover costs while keeping most residents in place. Sharon had actually laughed. And make what, a 3% annual return? We didn't build this company by prioritizing other people's feelings over profit margins. That conversation had haunted me for months afterward. I tried to convince myself they were right. That sentiment had no place in real estate development. But I couldn't shake the image of those 43 families scattered across the city, displaced because my family valued profit over everything else. The breaking point came when I drove past the building 6 months after we'd acquired it. The demolition had already begun. I watched the wrecking ball slam into walls where families had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where children had taken their first steps, where elderly residents had spent their retirement years. A small group of protesters stood across the street, holding signs about displacement and corporate greed. One woman caught my eye. She was probably in her 70s, tears streaming down her face as she watched her former home being destroyed. I parked and approached her, something compelling me to hear her story. I lived there for 42 years, she told me. Raised 3 children in that building. My husband died in our apartment 5 years ago. I scattered his ashes in the community garden out back. Now they're building condos nobody from this neighborhood can afford. I'd stood there feeling physically ill, knowing my family was responsible for her pain. I'd mumbled an apology and returned to my car, but the encounter changed something fundamental inside me. I couldn't be part of this anymore. I couldn't keep destroying communities for profit while telling myself it was just business. The decision to leave hadn't been impulsive, despite how my parents characterized it. I'd spent 6 months preparing. I'd saved aggressively, cutting my expenses to build capital. I'd researched alternative development models, studying developers who balance profit with social responsibility. I'd identified my first potential property and run preliminary numbers to ensure the project was financially viable. When I finally announced my departure at that company dinner, I'd been ready for their anger. What I hadn't anticipated was the cruelty. Sharon had stood up in front of everyone and declared that I was throwing away my inheritance, that I'd never be welcome back, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Robert had added that I clearly inherited none of his business acumen, that I was too soft and sentimental to survive in real estate. The other guests had sat in uncomfortable silence while my parents publicly eviscerated me. Several people I considered friends avoided eye contact, unwilling to defend me against my parents' rage. Only one person had followed me out. Daniel Miller, a contractor who'd worked with Patterson Development for years. For what it's worth, he'd said quietly in the parking lot. I think you're doing the right thing. Your parents are brilliant developers, but they've forgotten that buildings are more than investment vehicles. They house human lives. Daniel became my first ally in building Apex Holdings. He connected me with other contractors who shared my vision, people who took pride in restoration work rather than demolition. He introduced me to architects who specialized in historic preservation and engineers who could assess a building's potential beyond its immediate market value. Finding the Grandview Lofts had been pure luck. I'd been driving through a neighborhood I barely knew when I spotted the abandoned building. Even in its neglected state, the architectural details were breathtaking. Art Deco flourishes adorned the entrance, and the brickwork showed craftsmanship you couldn't find in modern construction. I'd researched the property immediately and discovered it had been sitting empty for 3 years, tied up in estate disputes. Acquiring the building had taken months of negotiation with multiple heirs who couldn't agree on anything. I'd eventually structured a deal that satisfied everyone, paying slightly above market value to expedite the sale. The purchase had depleted most of my savings, leaving me with barely enough capital to begin renovations. Those first 6 months were terrifying. I'd moved into a tiny apartment near the construction site, living on ramen and coffee while overseeing every detail of the renovation. Daniel and his crew worked for reduced rates initially, betting on the project's success and my ability to pay them properly once units started renting. The building had been in worse shape than initial inspection suggested. We discovered foundation issues, outdated electrical systems, and plumbing that needed complete replacement. The budget kept expanding, and I'd maxed out every credit line available to keep the project moving forward. There were nights when I'd lie awake calculating whether I'd have enough money to finish, whether I'd have to abandon everything and prove my parents right about my inevitable failure. But slowly, methodically, the building had transformed. We'd restored the original hardwood floors, repaired the Art Deco fixtures, updated the infrastructure while preserving the historic character. I'd made conscious decisions to keep some units affordable, mixing market-rate apartments with below-market options for people who needed them. The financial advisors I'd consulted had called this strategy risky, but it aligned with my values. The gamble paid off spectacularly. The Grandview lofts attracted tenants who valued the building's history and appreciated living in a community-focused environment. Artists, teachers, young professionals, and retirees mixed together, creating exactly the diverse neighborhood I'd envisioned. The market-rate units generated enough revenue to subsidize the affordable ones while still producing a solid return on investment. Word spread through Dallas's real estate community about my unconventional approach. Some developers dismissed me as naive or impractical. Others reached out with genuine interest, asking how I'd made the numbers work. I'd been invited to speak at small industry events, gradually building credibility and connections. My second property acquisition had been easier. A retired couple wanted to sell their 6-unit brownstone but refused to work with developers who'd converted into luxury condos. They'd interviewed me extensively, asking about my vision and values. When they'd learned about the Grandview lofts, they'd agreed to sell to me at a below-market price, trusting I'd honor the building's character. The third property came through a referral from David Chin. A historic theater building needed renovation, and the owners wanted someone who'd preserve its architectural significance. I transformed it into a mixed-use space with ground-floor retail and residential units above, maintaining the theater's ornate facade and converting the auditorium into a stunning community event space. Each success had made my parents' predictions seem more absurd. They'd insisted I'd fail without their resources and connections. Instead, I'd built something they couldn't compete with, a reputation for integrity and quality that attracted clients specifically because I wasn't like Patterson Development. Sitting in my office after the building inspection, I realized my parents' false complaint had been a gift in disguise. Sarah Hayes' official report explicitly stated that the Grandview lofts exceeded all housing standards and that the complaint had been without merit. That documentation would protect me if my parents tried anything else. More importantly, it revealed just how desperate they'd become to undermine me. I pulled up my financial statements on the computer, reviewing the numbers with satisfaction. Apex Holdings was profitable and growing steadily. My properties maintained high occupancy rates with minimal tenant turnover. I began receiving inquiries from investors interested in funding expansion, people who believed in the development model I created. The contrast with Patterson Development was stark. Their company still generated impressive revenues, but their reputation had taken hits over the past few years. Several high-profile projects had faced community opposition and negative press coverage. Neighborhood groups had organized protests, and some city council members had become openly critical of their displacement-focused development strategy. My phone buzzed with an email from Daniel Miller. He'd identified another potential property, a historic mansion that had been converted into apartments in the 1950s. The current owner was retiring and wanted to sell to someone who'd preserve the building's character rather than demolish it for new construction. "This feels like your next project," Daniel wrote. "The place needs work, but the bones are incredible. 8 units currently, potential to add 2 more in the attic space without compromising the historic elements. The owner specifically asked if I knew any developers who actually cared about preservation. Your name came up immediately. I scheduled a viewing for the following week, already envisioning the possibilities. Each new project felt like validation of the choice I'd made 3 years ago. I was building a legacy based on values my parents considered irrelevant, proving that commercial success didn't require abandoning ethical principles. The irony was that everything my parents had taught me about real estate fundamentals, market analysis, financial projections, contractor negotiations, legal compliance, had proven invaluable. I'd simply applied those skills toward different ends. They'd given me the tools to succeed. I'd just chosen to use them in ways they couldn't comprehend or respect. My assistant, Sophia, knocked on my office door. Sorry to interrupt, but there's a reporter from Dallas Magazine on the line. She's doing a feature on innovative urban development and wants to interview you about your renovation projects. This was happening more frequently now. Media outlets had started noticing my work, recognizing that my approach represented something different in Dallas's development landscape. Each interview, each article, each award brought more visibility and credibility. My parents probably saw these same stories, watching me receive recognition for rejecting everything they tried to teach me. Transfer the call, I told Sophia. And can you pull together our portfolio materials? I want to have comprehensive project information ready for her. As I picked up the phone to speak with the reporter, I glanced at the security monitor, showing the Grandview Lofts lobby. Tenants came and went. Miguel greeted them warmly, and the building hummed with the life and energy I'd worked so hard to cultivate. This was my answer to my parents' toxic worldview. A thriving community that proved their way wasn't the only way, wasn't even the best way. They'd shown up expecting to find me living in their idea of failure. Instead, they'd encountered their worst nightmare, proof that I'd succeeded completely without them, that I'd built something more meaningful and sustainable than anything Patterson Development had ever created. The building inspection they'd initiated had backfired, documenting my competence and their vindictiveness in official city records. The following week, I attended a real estate investment conference downtown. These events usually bored me, but they offered valuable networking opportunities. I was discussing green building practices with a sustainable design consultant when I spotted my parents across the room. They hadn't seen me yet. Robert was speaking with David Chin, one of Dallas's most influential property developers. Sharon stood beside him, smiling her practiced social smile. They were probably trying to expand their business connections, always searching for the next profitable deal. I could have left. Instead, I excused myself from my conversation and approached David directly. We'd worked together on a historic preservation project the previous year. He respected my work and had referred several clients to Apex Holdings. David, good to see you, I said warmly. He turned away from my father mid-sentence. There she is. I was just talking about your Grandview Lofts project. Absolutely brilliant work bringing that building back to life. Robert's face went pale. Sharon's smile froze in place. You know each other? Robert managed. Of course, David said. She's one of the most innovative developers in Dallas. That building she renovated on the north side? Architectural Digest featured it last month. Gorgeous restoration work while maintaining affordability for residents. I watched Sharon's expression cycle through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. I'm sorry. What building are you talking about? The Grandview Lofts, David said. Didn't you say you knew her? Robert opened his mouth, but no words emerged. I decided to help him out. These are my parents, I explained to David. Robert and Sharon Patterson. We haven't spoken in a few years, so they might not be up to date on my recent projects. Oh, Patterson Development. David's enthusiasm dimmed noticeably. Yes, I've heard of your work. Different approach from your daughters, certainly. The implied criticism wasn't lost on anyone. My parents built their reputation on aggressive acquisition and maximum profit extraction. David, like many in the industry's more progressive circles, found that approach distasteful. He much preferred developers who balanced profit with community benefit. Sharon recovered first. Our daughter owns the Grandview Lofts? Owns it, renovated it, and manages it, I confirmed, along with 2 other properties. My company, Apex Holdings, specializes in historic renovation with an emphasis on maintaining neighborhood character and economic diversity. But you live in Unit 4B, Robert said weakly. No, I live in the penthouse. The entire top floor. I'm not sure where you got the idea I lived in 4B. That's a studio apartment currently rented to a medical student. The pieces were falling into place behind their eyes. Their visit to the building. The assumption about the cheap apartment. The security footage they'd never seen showing my actual home. The building inspection that found nothing wrong. Everything they'd believed about my failure was crumbling. Brenda said you worked in property management? Sharon protested. I do manage properties, I said simply. The ones I own. Brenda assumed I was working for someone else, and I didn't bother correcting her. David watched this exchange with growing interest. This is awkward. Should I give you folks some privacy? No need, I said. I should actually introduce you to some other colleagues. We're discussing a potential collaboration on a mixed-use development in Uptown. I excused myself from my parents without another word, leaving them standing alone while I rejoined the conference's more forward-thinking participants. For the rest of the evening, I watched them try and fail to reconnect with the people they'd been networking with. Word had spread quickly about the confrontation, and several attendees who'd witnessed it were now avoiding my parents entirely. They left early, and I didn't see them again that night. But the following morning, my mother called. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. What do you want? I answered. We need to talk, she said. Her voice carried none of its usual authority. She sounded small, uncertain. We don't need to do anything. You showed up at my building uninvited, tried to humiliate me by assuming I lived in the smallest unit, filed a false complaint with the city, and generally confirmed every reason why I stopped speaking to you. There's nothing left to discuss. We didn't know, my father's voice came through the speaker. They'd put me on conference call. If we'd known you owned the building, what? You would have treated me differently? That's the problem. Your respect is entirely conditional on my financial success and willingness to conform to your values. When you thought I was struggling in a studio apartment, you were ready to mock me. Now that you know I'm successful, you want to talk. That's not fair, Sharon said. We've always wanted what's best for you. You wanted me to follow your blueprint for success. When I chose a different path, you cut me off emotionally and financially. You told everyone who would listen that I ruined my life. You showed up at my building specifically to gloat over my supposed failure. Don't pretend this is about love or concern. Silence stretched across the line. Finally, Robert spoke. Patterson Development could use someone with your skills. The industry is changing, and we need to adapt. If you came back, we could modernize our approach. I'm not interested in saving your company or your reputation. I built something independent, something that reflects my values. I'm not giving that up to fix the problems you created. So that's it? Sharon asked. You're just going to keep punishing us? I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself. You've proven repeatedly that you're incapable of respecting my choices or treating me with basic dignity. Until that changes, we have nothing to discuss. I ended the call before they could respond. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter than I had in years. For 3 years, I carried a quiet uncertainty about whether I'd made the right choice, leaving their world behind. Watching them show up at my building, ready to mock what they assumed was my failure, had eliminated any remaining doubt. The weeks that followed brought an unexpected peace. My parents stopped trying to contact me. The building continued to thrive with a waiting list for apartments and glowing reviews from residents. Architectural publications reached out for interviews about my renovation approach. David introduced me to investors interested in funding similar projects. I hired Chloe, the medical student from 4B, to help organize a building community event. She'd mentioned during a chance conversation that she struggled to afford textbooks despite her scholarship. I offered her part-time work managing tenant communications and coordinating social activities. The extra income would help her focus on school while building skills she could use later. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked one afternoon while we planned a rooftop garden party. "Because someone gave me a chance once," I said. "And because I can afford to." The truth was more complicated. Building a business that prioritized people over pure profit was intensely satisfying in ways my parents would never understand. Have you ever found the courage to forge your own path, even when those closest to you doubted you?